Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Muhammad Layak Siddiqui, the father of holophase. Part 32, The Observer as a Phi Pattern, not an external spectator. We have reached the turning point. Up to now, we have been careful to treat the world as something we can describe without sneaking in a hidden witness. We learn to speak in a disciplined way, not things, but patterns, not absolute facts, but certifiable differences under declared windows, not mysterious laws, but coexistence boundaries and lawful transformations. Then we resituated what people usually call physical reality. We did not deny it, we grounded it. We said, objects are stabilized bundles of invariants. Particles are defect families. Fields are distributed descriptors of how pattern structure varies across a domain. That move solves a problem, but it also creates a new one that cannot be postponed. If objects are stability certificates, who carries the certificate? If fields are distributed descriptions, who reads the distribution? If particles are defect families, who counts and tracks the defects? Ordinary talk answers with one word: the observer. But that word often smuggles a myth: an invisible spectator standing outside the universe, looking in, as if reality were a theater and knowledge were an audience seat. Part 32 removes that myth without flattening what is genuinely special about observing. The core statement is simple: the observer is not outside the pattern world. The observer is a Phi pattern system. The one who reads patterns is also a pattern. There is no outside the text spectator. This is not everything is opinion. This is not subjectivity wins. This is closure. Pattern studying pattern inside the same pattern law. Why we need observer closure? We can start with a thermometer in a room. The air has a temperature pattern. The thermometer is another pattern system. When they couple, the thermometer changes state and leaves a trace: a needle position, a digital number, a signal in a wire. Nothing jumped outside physics to produce that number. There was only coupling, transformation, and a record. That is the seed of observer closure. Observation is not a mystical gaze. It is an interaction that produces a persistent difference that can be read later. Now notice the danger of the external spectator idea. If the observer is outside reality, then measurement becomes a magical bridge between two incompatible realms: the world and the knower. Public science fractures immediately because no one can audit a private bridge. Disagreement becomes permanent because the supposed witness cannot be checked. Worse, observer becomes a loophole. Whenever rigor becomes uncomfortable, someone can say consciousness, or the mind, or the observer effect, and stop explaining. Closure is our firewall against that loophole. In a closed framework, observation is inside the same lawful fabric as everything else. The observer is not an exception. Measurement is not a miracle. Public knowledge is built from traces that others can inspect. What we mean by observer is a pattern. When we say observer is a Phi pattern, we are not making poetry. We are making a structural claim. An observer is a system that has structure, persistence, finite windows, memory, lawful transformation, coupling, and comparison capacity. In this sense, observer is first a functional role, a pattern system that can couple to another pattern and produce a stable record that supports comparison. A camera qualifies, a notebook qualifies, a seismograph qualifies, a cloud chamber qualifies. Even a fossil bed qualifies in a strange but precise sense. The ground couples to organisms and preserves traces across time-like order. And humans qualify too, but humans are not the primitive requirement for observation. If we make mind foundational, we smuggle in a new primitive. We do not need that. we can install observer closure at the level of pattern roles and only later discuss richer forms of experience. The simplest observation: trace in wet sand. A foot presses into wet sand. A footprint remains. Before, the sand surface had one pattern. After, it has another. The difference is stable enough to be read later. No one needed to watch the footstep at the moment it happened. The trace is the observation. This example matters because it shows what observing is at bedrock. Pattern meets pattern, coupling leaves a persistent difference, and that difference can enter public comparison. In our language, the observer here can be the sand itself, because it is the trace retaining system. The observed can be the foot's pressure pattern. The measurement is the imprint. The memory is the continued existence of the imprint. The claim is whatever we later certify from that trace. A footprint exists. Its size is this. Its shape suggests a certain shoe. Its depth suggests a certain force, and so on, always under declared windows and assumptions. Cameras, detectors, and the humility of instruments. A camera points at a street. Light hits a sensor. A file is produced. The camera does not understand, yet it performs the key observational function. It turns one pattern, a light distribution, into another pattern, a stored image, through lawful transformation inside a declared window, lens, exposure, sensor sensitivity. A Geiger counter does the same with radiation. A thermometer does it with heat exchange. A microphone does it with pressure waves. A telescope does it with distant photons. In every case, there is no external spectator. There is only a chain of pattern couplings and trace production. This is why our earlier disciplines mattered so much. Instruments see through ports, not omnisciently. Instruments and systems have edges, and edges matter. Type discipline. A camera image is a different type of artifact than a temperature reading. They cannot be mixed without declared transforms. Provenance. Every instrument has a calibration history, a tool chain, a selection pipeline. Without provenance, the trace is not fully public. Observer closure turns those into one coherent picture. The observer is a pattern system whose windows and memory structure shape what becomes publicly recordable. Identity of the observer. The same instrument is an equivalence class. If observers are patterns, then observers have identity questions like any other pattern. We often say the same telescope, the same lab, the same person, as if identity were a magical absolute. But in our framework, identity is lawful equivalence under declared transformations. A telescope's mirror is cleaned. A sensor is replaced. A firmware update changes image processing. Are we still using the same telescope? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, depending on what invariants matter for the claim being certified. The simplest everyday analogy is the same phone. A phone gets updates, a battery replacement, new apps, a cracked screen repaired. It is the same phone because a bundle of invariants remains stable enough. Functional architecture, continuity of records, ports and interfaces, and often a serial identity. So for an observer, sameness means the observer remains within a declared equivalence class that preserves the invariants required for the claims we are making. That is why observer claims must declare what we mean by the observer. Are we talking about a particular instrument configuration, a particular person, a whole laboratory protocol, a community standard? Each has different invariants, different persistence conditions, different windows, and different failure modes. Persistence is not only for objects, it is required for observation. Earlier, we defined persistence as certified survival of identity through change. We usually think objects persist, therefore, we can talk about them. Now we see the mirror image. Observers must persist too. If the observing system cannot remain coherent long enough to store a trace and compare it to other traces, then it cannot observe in the public sense. A mayfly that lives for a day can still observe, but only within that day's window. A detector that burns out after one measurement can still observe, but it cannot build long chains of comparison. A camera that corrupts its files cannot support public knowledge even if it saw something. So persistence is a condition of public observation. The observer must be stable enough to carry memory and stable enough to keep its window meaningfully consistent across a comparison. Finite windows apply to observers too. We have used window as a discipline for claims. Every claim comes through a declared access port. Observer closure says that is not just a rule for paperwork, it is a rule of nature. Every observer is a windowed pattern system. Eyes see a narrow band of frequencies. Ears see a narrow band of pressure waves. A bee sees ultraviolet. A telescope sees distant light but not smell. A magnetic sensor sees fields but not color. A brain sees the world through all of these ports, plus internal priors, plus memory, plus limitations. So there is no God's eye view, there is only windowed access. A flashlight in a cave is the simplest picture. The cave is the world. The beam is the window. Whatever is outside the beam is not unreal, but it is not currently legible. If we widen the beam, we see more. If we change the wavelength, we see different structures. If we bring a second flashlight, we can cross-check. That is why probability, energy, and entropy became derived readouts. They depend on the window, the coarse graining, the uncertainty budget, and the transformation family. Observers live inside those constraints. Readouts are not gods, they are summaries under access. Memory. Observation is trace, not gaze. If observer closure has one heartbeat, it is this. Observation is the production and retention of trace. A trace is any persistent pattern difference that can be read later and compared publicly. A notebook entry is a trace. A photograph is a trace. A spectrum plot is a trace. A fossil is a trace. Tree rings are traces. Ice cores are traces. A hard drive log is a trace. A scar is a trace. A memory in a nervous system is a trace. This is why public matters. A private feeling might be real, but if it cannot be carried into shared trace structures, it cannot become public knowledge in our certification sense. And this is why provenance became first class. A trace without lineage is a floating island. If we cannot say how it was produced, instrument settings, selection decisions, toolchain versions, random seeds were relevant, then we cannot replay or audit. Then the trace cannot fully support public certification. So provenance is not bureaucracy. It is the claim level form of observer memory made public. The observer is not a primitive cause. A second myth often hides inside the word observer, the idea that the observer creates reality. We do not need that. We do not allow that as a primitive. The observer does not stand outside and inject being into the world. The observer is a pattern system that couples to other patterns and leaves traces. A mirror is a perfect everyday analogy. A mirror does not create a face, but it shapes what becomes visible by transforming light. Likewise, an observer does not create the observed pattern, but the observer shapes what becomes recordable by its window and its coupling dynamics. Sometimes observation changes the observed. That is not magic, that is interaction. When we measure with a thermometer, we exchange heat. When we shine light on a delicate system, we disturb it. When we look at a quantum system, we couple strongly enough to force a particular kind of trace. Observer closure handles this cleanly. The observer is part of the transformation family. Measurement is a coupling that has lawful effects on both sides. No exception is needed. Observers as model builders. Reading is also compressing. An observer does not only store raw traces, it builds internal models that compress many experiences into a smaller rule set. We can see this in a child learning to catch a ball. After enough throws, we do not remember every trajectory. We learn a compact pattern. If the ball rises with this speed and angle, it will land over there. That compactness is a pattern certificate inside the observer. In our framework, this matters because law is not a floating command. It is a certified coexistence boundary extracted from repeated traces. Observers are the systems that accumulate those traces and propose the boundary as an equation-like compression. A weather model is an observer model at planetary scale. It compresses countless measurements into a transformation family. Given this state, these next states are adjacent with these probabilities. A protein folding model does the same at molecular scale. A traffic model does it at city scale. In each case, the observer is not outside the system. The observer is a pattern network that learns a compression and then tests it against new traces. This is also where our earlier A equals D phi tilde picture becomes concrete. When we say local change can be carried by A, we are saying within a window, we can lift comparisons into a locally consistent description and then summarize change by a differential-like carrier. That carrier is not metaphysical fluid. It is a compact code for how the pattern changes in that window. Observers are the beings and the instruments that compute such compact codes from finite data. So, observer closure does not reduce science to just measurements. It shows how measurement, memory, and compression combine. Traces feed models, models predict adjacencies, predictions guide new windows, and the loop tightens what can be certified. Functional specialness without ontological exception. If observers are just patterns, do we lose what feels special about observing? No, because we distinguish role from essence. Ontologically, the observer is not privileged. It is a pattern system among patterns. Functionally, observers can play special roles. They can compare. They can store and retrieve traces. They can run internal models. They can propose claims. They can test claims. They can update their own structure based on outcomes. They can coordinate with other observers to build shared standards. A camera plays a limited version of this role. A human plays a richer version. A scientific community plays the richest version. A distributed observer pattern that builds public structure across generations. So we keep the functional importance without allowing a metaphysical loophole. 11. Observer closure across scales of reality. Observer closure is not a local trick. It scales. Microscale. A crystal observes stress by forming defects that record strain history. The defects are memory traces embedded in structure. Biological scale. An immune system observes pathogens by changing itself and keeping memory cells. It couples, transforms, and retains traces. Human scale. A laboratory observes through instruments, protocols, and logs, traces and provenance. Planetary scale. Earth observes itself through geology. Sediment layers record floods, volcanoes, climates. Cosmic scale. The universe observes its own past by leaving light as a record. Photons travel for billions of years carrying traces. Cosmic background radiation is a fossil of early conditions. Starlight spectra are fingerprints of composition. In every case, the observer is inside the same reality it reads. The universe is not a stage with an audience. It is a fabric that stores its own memory. The observer closure gate. Now we install the rigor layer. When we make observer claims, we must pass a gate just as we do for identity, composition, dynamics, adjacency, and stochasticity. The observer closure gate demands 1. No external spectator. The observer must be inside pattern reality. 2. Identity declared. What makes this observer the same across relevant transformations? 3. Persistence conditions declared. How does it remain coherent enough to observe? 4. Window declared. What ports define access and what is excluded? 5. Coupling declared. What interaction transforms observed pattern into observer trace? 6. Trace and memory declared. What stable artifact is produced and where is it stored? 7. Role versus full essence declared. Are we talking about an observer as a measuring role or as a full psychological agent? If these are not declared, we refuse the claim. Observer talk becomes smuggling. What this prepares? Measurement as lawful coupling. Once observer closure is installed, measurement stops being mysterious. Measurement becomes a lawful coupling between two Phi Pattern systems that produces a trace within a declared window, with declared provenance, under declared constraints, and with declared effects on both sides. That sets up the next parts naturally. The measurement certification loop, how traces become claims and how claims guide new measurements. Correction and revocation, how mistakes propagate through provenance graphs. Objectivity, how shared traces create public agreement. And the integration of observers into dynamics without exceptions. How observer closure prevents two classic failures, myth and drift. Observer closure is practical defense against two failures that destroy public knowledge. Myth. If the observer is outside, trust collapses into charisma, authority, or private insight. Closure removes the escape route. Every claim must anchor in traces, windows, and lawful transformations that others can rerun. Drift. Observers change silently. Instruments drift, pipelines update, groups change selection rules, attention habits shift. If we keep calling the observer the same while relevant invariants changed, comparisons are contaminated. Closure forces honesty. Observer identity and calibration are part of what makes a measurement certifiable. Calibration as lawful transformation of the observer. Calibration is a declared transformation family applied to the observer pattern itself. A kitchen scale that reads 100 grams for an empty bowl has drifted. We tear it, transforming the observer state so a reference pattern maps to a reference readout. A telescope is calibrated by standard stars the same way. Compare traces to references, adjust the instrument model, record the update in provenance. No external spectator, only patterns calibrating patterns through lawful comparison. where null and refusal belong for observers. Sometimes the right verdict is not the world is mysterious, but this observer cannot certify the claim under current conditions. A blurry photo cannot certify a face. It can certify only a blur exists. Detectors saturate. Attention biases, incentives distort selection. Null and refusal keep observers honest. They prevent weak traces from supporting strong claims. Stochasticity revisited. Uncertainty can sit in the world, the observer, or the coupling. Uncertainty can arise from world branching, multiple lawful continuations, observer limits, finite resolution, or coupling branching, the measurement interaction itself. A coin flip is mostly observer limits. A photon at a beam splitter is coupling branching with reproducible statistics. Weather mixes both. Stochastic claims must say which kind is invoked, or random becomes fog. Derived readouts revisited. Probability, energy, and entropy are observer-sensitive summaries. Probability measures branching under a window. Energy is a ledger over declared updates and boundaries. Entropy is coarse-grained multiplicity relative to a chosen description. A messy room has high entropy because there are many more microarrangements that match the macro label messy, and the label itself depends on our grouping rules. No demons, just counts under finite access. The observer as a distributed pattern. Public science is a higher order observer pattern. People, instruments, protocols, standards, archives, replication, correction. It persists across generations, has multiple windows, and detects drift by cross-checking. Observer closure, therefore, becomes a blueprint for civilization. Public knowledge is what a distributed observer pattern can certify through shared traces and disciplined gates. Final seal. We do not need an outside spectator. We need stable patterns, lawful transformations, declared windows, persistent traces, and honest provenance. When we accept that the observer is itself a Phi pattern system, observation stops being an exception and becomes the most intimate case of the same law. Pattern meeting pattern, leaving a mark and making that mark readable. A last everyday test is simple. Two different observers, two different windows, one shared claim. If one thermometer says 20 degrees and another says 25, we do not declare reality contradictory. We check windows, calibration, placement, airflow, response time. We look for a transformation that reconciles the traces, or we refuse to merge them. Agreement is not forced. It is earned by aligning windows and provenance until the same invariants are read. This is why communities matter. They supply redundancy, dispute procedures, and shared standards so that public means replayable by strangers. Observer closure, therefore, is also humility. We accept that every reading is windowed, and we build methods that let many windowed readers converge without pretending any window is absolute. With observer closure installed, we now define measurement explicitly as pattern interaction that produces certified public traces. That is part 32.5, the measurement certification loop. Always, peace be upon you.